This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hello everyone, welcome to part 4 of the series on the science behind outdoor play with Gemma Goldenberg, who is a PhD researcher that left her job as an assistant head teacher to research the impact of being outdoors on children's stress, attention and self-regulated behaviour. Thank you very much, Gemma, for joining once again.
Thank you.
So Gemma's already shared the first set of results with us around the impact of noise levels on children's stress levels. So in this episode, Gemma's going to share with us further findings around whether children pay better attention and display more self-regulated behaviour indoors or outdoors. So it would be great, Gemma, to get a little background on the existing research around the effects of outdoors on attention and behaviour, I think, first.
Sure, yeah. So with attention in particular, there's quite a lot of research out there already that's been going on since sort of 1960s, 70s onwards. Lots of it's been done with adults, but there are some studies with children as well. They tend to be slightly older children than early years. But there are lots of studies that look at your kind of exposure to green space over the lifetime. So how much green space you had around your home when you were growing up, for example, and linking that to things like your IQ or your performance on attention tasks. And there seems to be a link between those two things. But as I said, that's looking at things more across a longer time frame. And then there are other studies where they look at the impact of being outside in the shorter term. So there's lots of studies that were done in Japan where they get adults to either sit or walk in a natural environment like a forest compared to doing that in an urban environment, for example, and then testing their attention and their memory afterwards and seeing if their performance improved. And there's quite a lot of research to show that we do seem to pay better attention on a particular task or a test after we've had that access to nature. And there are 1 or 2 studies showing that with younger children, with preschoolers as well, showing this link between spending more time outdoors and then there being lower odds of you being hyperactive or inattentive as you get a little bit older.
And that's interesting because we do hear a lot of general research around the outdoors being calming. So it's interesting to see the effects of the outdoors on children specifically and younger children, especially because I think on previous episodes, we talked about the impact of the outdoors on children's attention specifically in terms of like, when we talk about environments, we think about overstimulating children indoors, and then that obviously has an impact in terms of when we take them outdoors, how does that impact their attention, behavior, learning, etc. We hear a lot of things around the outdoors being a lot more calming, but why is important to kind of understand and then really understand if that is the case or not. So I guess this is what your research kind of has showed, what really is significant, what isn't, which would be really interesting to hear now.
Yeah, I think there are differences of opinion there as well, because I definitely speak to people who say, my class are much calmer when they're outdoors. And as we mentioned in kind of the last podcast, noise levels and stress levels were lower outdoors, at least in the research that I did. But then there's also research out there that says that lots of people don't like taking children outdoors because they think children's behaviour is worse outdoors, or it's harder to get them to focus, and that they struggle more with behaviour management. There have been a few surveys that have looked at why don't people take children outdoors more often, and that's often cited as one of the reasons. So it was important in this research for me to look at that as well. Like, is it more difficult to manage children's behaviour when they're in an outdoor environment instead of in their usual classroom indoors?
Yeah, because of the impact the outdoors has in terms of those energy levels. I guess a lot of people say, we'll take children outdoors if they've got too much energy and they can release that energy, but actually it gives them, sometimes sparks more energy in terms of, running around and having all that freedom, and actually they're more stimulated, just like exercise stimulates us and kind of wakes us up.
Yeah, so in the study that I did, we were quite careful with the amount of space they had outdoors. So we measured the indoor classroom, and then outdoors they had the same amount of space. So we didn't have quite that same thing where they were able to be a lot more physically active than they were indoors. But definitely if you're just taking them out into a wide open space, that's quite a big impact on them.
And I guess it goes back to what we discussed again in previous episodes of making sure those measures are controlled. And how did you manage that in terms of the study? Just kind of a bit of a recap. Obviously, you mentioned space being the same. Were there any other parts of the study that you managed?
Yeah, so we tried to keep pretty much everything the same except for the environment itself, whether it was indoors or outdoors. So it's the same teacher running the sessions. The children had the same resources and activities, indoors or outdoors. We tried to use a lot of the same furniture, even kind of taking tables and chairs and book corners and things like that out with us. It was the same group of children as well. You know, some studies, it's one group of children that do all the indoor sessions and one group of children that do all the outdoors, whereas this was exactly the same set of children in each condition. So we did try and keep everything as consistent as we could.
And in terms of actually conducting the research itself on this particular part of the study, so the attention and behaviour, there were different measures that you took as well in terms of measuring different things, not just one way of measuring children's behaviour or attention.
Yeah, exactly. So as I mentioned, a lot of the research that's already out there, they use a specific attention test or a specific task for people to do. And I didn't want to do that because they tend to be the sorts of things that get used only in research and not in real life settings. So even if I found, children do 20% better on this attention test when they're outdoors, I felt like, you know, early years practitioners might say, well, so what? We don't give them those kind of tasks. So it doesn't really mean anything to us. But it's really difficult to measure whether children are paying attention or not. So, you know, one of the measures that I had was using the footage from the head-mounted cameras that the children were wearing. During story time, we looked at how much time the child spent looking at either the teacher or the book compared to just looking all around them at everything else. So that was one of the measures that, you know, we called it looking time. But of course, you just whether they're looking in the right place doesn't mean they're necessarily paying attention.
Yeah, exactly.
A child could be looking right at you and not taking anything in, or a child could be staring at the clouds and absorbing everything. So we couldn't just have that as a measure. So as well as that, there was also like a comprehension task based on the story that the children had been read indoors and outside, and where they had to sequence pictures from the story and retell it in their own words and answer some questions about it. So that was to kind of show as well, were they just looking or were they actually, absorbing it as well? Again, I couldn't just do those two because there might be children who speak English as a second language or didn't have the language and communication skills to be able to really tune into that story. So as well as that, we had from the footage as well, from the head-mounted cameras, we looked at how much time do the children spend on task at the activities that the teachers have set up versus time that they were just sort of aimlessly wandering around or just sitting down but not engaging with anything. Again, I didn't want to just do that because a child could be on task for like 90% of the time, but just flitting from one thing to another, to another, to another, and never really sticking with anything. So in one way, that might be great because they're experiencing lots of different things. But I also thought teachers are going to want to know what's their sustained attention like. Can they really focus on one thing and stick with that one thing? So as well as time on task, I also looked at their peak focus, which was the longest amount of time they spent on just one activity without moving on. So compared that indoors and outdoors as well. And then finally, the last one was to kind of tap into that research where teachers think children might be more difficult to manage outside. And I counted the number of times that teachers had to intervene to redirect children's attention during a story time or a maths lesson. So if they, clapped their hands and said, look at me, or we need to calm down, or you need to go and sit over there because you keep chatting to your friend, then I was kind of keeping a tally of every time that happened so I could look at it, if it happened more indoors or outdoors. And the teacher didn't know that I was doing that because obviously otherwise that might change the way that they behave, to keep that part of the study confidential. So that was all the measures for attention. And then for looking at their self-regulation, obviously attention is part of that as well. You are self-regulating to be able to pay attention. But in terms of their behaviour, I also used the camera footage to look at every time there was a pro-social or an anti-social incident between two or more children. And again, sort of counted all those up for every child for their 8 indoor and their 8 outdoor sessions to see whether children were generally more anti-social or pro-social indoors or outside.
So, yeah, a lot of those measures are really vital to kind of look at together. Like you mentioned at the very beginning, looking time. And when I first read that in the article, I did think exactly what you just said. You know, some children may actually be turned away or looking down, or if they're outdoors looking at the clouds, and actually have a lot more, display a lot more attention or pay more attention and feel calmer if they're not directly looking at the teacher, perhaps. So it's so vital to consider those individual differences with children. And we talk about that all the time in early years. So that's where those measures come in that not only make the research kind of more, I guess, accurate or reliable in research terms, but actually people who are reading this, that are educators, can relate to it in a way, I guess, and kind of think, okay, well, my child won't look at the story, but I know that they're still paying attention. So it almost gives it more credibility, not just in research terms, but more like educational terms. And like you mentioned, things that teachers do actually care about and pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, the looking time one was really interesting, actually, because once we analysed all the data, that came out differently to how I was expecting. I expected children would look at the teacher and look at the book more in the outdoor environment, because it's a less overstimulating environment. It's a quieter environment. So I thought that would help them just tune in more and kind of look at the target that they're supposed to be looking at. But actually, it was the only thing where there was a significant difference between the two. The children did actually look significantly more inside than they did outside, which is the opposite of what I was expecting. But then when I looked at it in combination with those results from the kind of comprehension and the sequencing task, it didn't matter. So the children did equally well in those comprehension and sequencing tasks indoors and outdoors. So even though they were looking at the target less outdoors, that didn't affect their comprehension and their recall of the story. So teachers are always quite interested when I share that result with them, because it kind of shows you really can't tell from where they're looking. And it's hard. You know, I've been a teacher and I used to say the same all the time. I need to see your eyes looking at me.
Yeah.
You're looking this way, so I know you're listening. But actually, you know, this research showed that in this case, the kind of the looking time and the comprehension didn't go hand in hand. They didn't necessarily influence each other.
And actually that supports that, I guess, good listening, in inverted commas, actually doesn't always look like what we traditionally see as good listening, or what someone may deem as good listening. And it all is, like I said earlier, very kind of individualized and dependent on each individual unique child and their preferences and their styles of learning as well.
And looking away, you know, we see this in lots of studies with young babies as well. If babies are overstimulated, they look away. It's, you know, it's called like gaze aversion. It's a way of self-regulating when you're overstimulated and it gets too much. And I think children do that as well. If they're overstimulated, sometimes they will look away and they will just kind of stare down at the carpet, because it's just a chance for their brain to catch up and stop having constant incoming information. And sometimes that can be misinterpreted as not good listening or not very good behaviour, but actually that is a type of self-regulation. They're regulating the amount of input they're getting.
Just a very quick and a very exciting announcement from me. The Voice of Early Childhood Conference is back. After the success of our first one, we have organised another one on the 16th of March, 2024. This will be a day full of learning, sparking reflections, sharing, discussing, and networking. Our overarching theme, which fits perfectly with the ethos of the Voice of Early Childhood, is advocacy, agency, and change. So we have Dr. Nathan Archer as one of our speakers, kicking off the conference with his keynote all around advocacy and activism in early childhood, followed by the rest of our brilliant speakers on the day, who are Adam Marriage, who will be discussing leading your team through Ofsted inspections, Dr. Stella Louis, talking about school readiness and intellectual readiness, a question of balance, Ben Kingston Hughes, exploring the power of play, Dr. Valerie Daniel, creative pedagogical practices to encourage agency, Ruth Swales, unpicking how do we construct our own curriculum, Helen Bately, talking about the foundations of early writing, and a special feature from Dr. Sue Allingham, Dr. Sue's surgery. which you can book into throughout the day. This is an opportunity for a one-to-one Q&A session with Dr. Sue, so really make the most of this special feature by coming prepared with your burning questions, whether this may be around practice, leadership, Ofsted perhaps, or anything else you can think of, you can ask Dr. Sue. We also have a whole conference discussion which is focused on sustainability in early childhood in the widest sense. So we'll be focusing on sustainable development goals, which we will discuss, debate, and really unpick what this means for early childhood and our responsibility as educators within this. Linked to this, there will be a student posters showcase around the Sustainable Development Goals, where we can engage in more discussion and reflections, really focusing on linking theory and academia to practice. So there's lots of in store for you on this really exciting day. And as always, you can expect on our conference day opportunities for shared reflection, discussion and healthy debate, valuable CPD, a diverse range of speakers, a safe space to share your practice and thoughts, a relaxed atmosphere, plenty of opportunities for networking, a selection of exhibitor stands to explore and ask questions, and of course, fantastic food and refreshments as always. And for 2024, we really had to step it up a notch with a choice of workshops, so a leadership or a practice strand to choose from, a start of the day and an end of the day keynote, interactive sessions, and of course our Q&A with Dr. Sue, which is new. So if this sounds like the kind of conference and early childhood community that you would like to be part of, then grab your tickets before they sell out. We do have limited capacity. And if you haven't already heard, you can get 10% off to use at checkout by signing up to our newsletter. I've added the link in this episode description where you can sign up for your code, find more info about the conference and speakers, and access our Eventbrite page to secure your ticket. So I will see you in March. So it's almost like from this research or this particular part that you mentioned, this finding, you didn't necessarily find the the data to support what you, I guess, were looking to find out and maybe expected, but actually it's still supporting some area of practice that is really, really important in terms of how do teachers respond to children's attention and children's behaviour.
Yeah, so we found in terms of like the general trends, we didn't find what I was expecting to find. So all those other measures that I mentioned of attention, when they were all run, all the proper kind of statistical analysis were run, none of them came out as having a significant difference between indoors and outdoors. So the amount of time spent on task, the peak focus, the number of times the teacher redirected, there might have been small differences between indoors and outdoors, but none of them reached statistical significance, which means, the chance of the results just being down to fluke is sort of 5% or less. And so I was a bit disappointed at first when I saw that. I was like, I really thought the outdoor environment was going to have an impact, and it hasn't had an impact. But actually, it wasn't true that it hadn't had an impact. It hadn't had an impact if we just averaged everything down. So as I said, all the children did 8 indoor sessions and 8 outdoor sessions. So for each child, we were averaging what had happened across all those sessions, and then putting them in with all the other children from their class and averaging that, and then putting them in with all the other classes and schools and averaging that. And when we did all of that, it looked like indoors and outdoors didn't make a difference. But in reality, there were lots of those children that were paying way better attention outside. But because there were also children that were paying way better attention inside, they kind of cancelled each other out. So I think it's tricky, especially when you're looking at educational research. As a teacher, it's not that useful to know that if you give your class a spelling test out of 10, the average score is 7. Because that doesn't mean that everyone in your class got 7 and everyone's doing kind of okay. You're going to have children in your class that got 1 and they need some extra support. And you're going to have children in your class that got 10 and they're going to need some extra challenge. So we never really use a class average. Yet that's sort of what we have to do in quantitative research. You're always looking at the average and you're looking at an overall effect and an overall trend. But when I actually looked individually at the children's data, you could see that for some of them, being outside was transformational. They were scoring twice as high on their comprehension tasks outside, or they were focusing for 2 or 3 times as long at a single activity. But on the other side of the coin, there were also children that did better inside. So it was really interesting to kind of unpick that. And I guess that's not surprising, because we know that all children are different. We know that they've got, different preferences and different needs. So it makes sense that they would respond differently to that environment. But it did make me think, particularly as children get older, I mean, we tend to be pretty good at offering outdoor access, I think, in the early years. Often as children move into year 1 and year 2, they lose that free flow with the outside. And they don't get a choice anymore. They have to do everything indoors. And yet for some of these children, we can see that they're just not performing at their best indoors, or they're not behaving at their best indoors. And so it's a real shame that they're not getting that opportunity to be outside as much.
And it's such an important thing to do, is focus on individual learners. And like you say, we just don't do enough of that in primary schools and secondary as well. I guess what this research has also shown for researchers is the fact that it's probably important to have not just very specific, focuses, and only one focus of your study, because you have found lots of other things out, and you've kind of sought to find out various things from different data that you've collated. This is just part of the findings, isn't it? We discussed so many more aspects of your study in the previous episodes. So I guess, if possible, obviously time-wise and maybe budget-wise as well, you can't necessarily always do a very big study or focus on various different things. You have to kind of really zone into one thing. But I guess would it almost, to a researcher, so to yourself, would it almost be quite disheartening if this is the only thing that you focused on and this is the only thing that you found? Because like you said, you were a little bit disappointed initially, but this isn't the only thing that you found.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I was disappointed there wasn't that general kind of trend, but interested to find out about those individual differences. I mean, as a researcher, for me, the most time-consuming thing is going into the schools and collecting the data. That's what takes a lot of time. So the way I approached it was, while I'm there anyway, let me measure as many different things as I can. Yeah. If you're using things like camera footage, you can analyse that in so many different ways. But the project did just keep expanding. There was so much more I could have done. I could have done 10 times as much, but you get to a point where you have to say, okay, enough is enough, because it becomes unmanageable. Because I also tried to look at, as I said, there were some children who were paying better attention or being more pro-social indoors, and some outdoors. So I tried to unpick that further to say, well, why? Is it specific groups of children that are doing better indoors or outdoors? Can I find something in common? So there were a load more analyses that I did, because I had a lot of data from the schools about the children. Did they speak English as a second language? Did they have any special needs? Were they entitled to free school meals? I looked at it in terms of gender, were they summer born or not? I ran all these different analyses, and interestingly, I couldn't find anything in common with the children that really, really benefited from being outside, except for their preference. So I asked the teachers at the start of the project, have you ever noticed whether this child's got a preference to being indoors or outside? And the children that the teachers had said, yes, they prefer being outside, were the ones that in general paid much better attention outside, which I guess isn't very surprising. They're going to do better where they prefer to be. It also, I think, goes to show we should take notice of those preferences, and we should ask, especially, like I said, in early years, if they've got the opportunity to be outside, you're going to notice as a practitioner, who always chooses to be outside when they can be, and who kind of shies away and prefers to be indoors. But when I was teaching, in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, I wouldn't have a clue which children preferred to be indoors or outside. I wouldn't have observed it. I wouldn't have asked it. But actually, now I've done this project, if I was going to go back and teach again, no matter which age group I was teaching with, that would be a question that I wanted to ask. Because if they say they prefer being outside, I'd want to be thinking, right, so when can I get them to read outside? When can I get them to be doing creative writing outside? How can I play into that preference, to help that child be in an optimal environment for them?
It really goes back to giving children ownership of their own learning, and that choice of the environment that they're in, but also listening to their voices. You know, whether you do, like you say, ask, or whether you observe, it's still listening to them as individuals. So I guess all of the things that we do in early years, or we would like to do, you know, according to best practice and theory and approaches, that is so vital for older children as well. Like you say, you know, when you were a teacher, and you work with older children, it's just as vital to look at those preferences and take them into consideration. And I guess make sure that there is enough time allowed for that, you know, taking children outdoors and not necessarily just staying indoors, where it may be a lot more practical in ways. But I guess that involves ensuring that senior leadership teams are also on board with things like that, because as soon as you do something a little bit different, then that questioning comes in. And I think that's when that practitioner and teacher agency is really vital, you know, saying this is why it's important. And that's why your research is so important, to say, I know that there is this evidence out there. But then again, the second thing I was going to say earlier is the importance of looking at the finer details, like you said, and not just those averages and the overall findings. So it's vital to really question what goes on beneath kind of the overall finding, the overall research that has been conducted, and what may be kind of commonly relayed as the findings, if we don't go into that depth that you've just described.
Yeah, I think you're right. And changing the way we do things, especially if it's the way it's always been done, is really hard, especially, like you said, convincing, you know, other stakeholders, whether that's parents or senior leadership team. And I hope that this kind of research will help with that. I mean, I was doing an inset day last week at a prep school, kind of sharing these findings with them through my Nest Kids training business. And it was really great to see that what they concluded from, like, not just my own research, but other research I was presenting to them as well, was thinking about that flexibility and autonomy. And yeah, they were talking about how can we get children outdoors more, but they were also just talking more broadly about, you know, how can we find out more about how the children like to learn, and what other kind of flexibility can we put in place? So even if we can't get outside, is there a space in a corridor they can use? Could we let them go over to that corner of the room? Should we stop insisting that everybody sits on a chair a certain way for doing their written work? Might some children want to lay down? Might some children want to stand up? And it just kind of generated some really good discussions about what do we need to control, and when can we release some of that control and give some of that choice and autonomy back to the children? Because often the children are really great at knowing what they need and how they learn best. They will do what naturally feels right to them. And that's often how they learn best.
Yeah, I think this is a really good example for researchers to consider all of the wider implications for practice, because of the things that you just said. But I think also in terms of going out and speaking to practitioners about your findings, like you have, and then getting those insights of how do they think about these things. Maybe they've interpreted your findings in a different way than to what you've interpreted them as. And in particular, interpreting the findings in a way of, like, how does this impact practice? Like you say, it's so much wider than just these are the findings on outdoor play, so we're only going to think about outdoor play here.
Yeah, and that's why it's great. You know, that's why I still love to, like, go in and work with schools and do things like this, where I can kind of reach an audience of people that are working with children day to day. You know, we've got to just keep on building that bridge between people that are working with children, people that are doing the research, and just make sure that we're kind of learning from each other and communicating what's going on.
Definitely. I 100% agree with that. I'm always talking about that kind of space between practice and academia, and theory and practice as well, and making sure that they're always aligned or at least interlinked and questioned together, and not just separated. I think this is probably a good point to kind of round off the discussion, and a good summary of really all the things that we've learned around making sure that we do share findings like this, and we do really look at all the finer details, and make sure that we do constantly kind of share it all widely, collaborate, discuss, reflect, debate, hear all those different voices, because, like you've demonstrated, it's just so useful for both sides.
Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity to kind of share all of this over the last few weeks. It's been a long project, and it's really nice when it comes to point when you've got findings to share and you can start thinking about how it might kind of inform people's practice going forward. So thanks a lot. It's been really nice to kind of have the opportunity to talk it through.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Thank you for sharing your work on this series. I think a lot of the people that have engaged, it's been great for them to actually share their voices on this as well, because we've seen people like on social media replying to the posts, and thank you to them as well for listening and also going out and saying, this is what I think. So that's great.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. So just say to all the listeners that all of Gemma's articles on this series can be found on the Voice of Early Childhood website, and the previous podcast episodes as well. So do go and check them out. Thank you very much.